Welcome back to the Handel Improvisation project, a series of videos made by myself and fellow YouTuber Bill Hilton, discussing a variety of ways you can use the chord progression from Handel's Ombre mai fu to improvise in different styles. In this video, we're going to talk about how you might improvise over the chord progression from this piece in the style of Bach, i.e. a Baroque style. The piece that the chord progression is from is an absolutely gorgeous piece of music. It's the opening aria from an opera that Handel wrote in 1738. So, if you haven't heard it yet, go back and watch Bill's intro video to this series, where you can find a full recording of it. If you want to follow along with the music, there's also a link to a PDF underneath this video that includes the sheet music as well as other useful materials that'll help you understand the topics covered in this series. So, with that being said, let's get right into it. So that was just an example of the type of improvisation we'll be hoping to achieve with the techniques I'm going to show you in this video. As I mentioned before, what we're going to be covering here is the style of Bach, who was known to be an incredible improviser himself. What we'll specifically be aiming for here is to mimic the style of one of his two-part inventions, which uses a basic style of contrapuntal writing, meaning that the music comprises multiple independent voices or lines. As the two-part invention name suggests, there are only two voices in this type of piece. Let me just play you the opening of one so you can hear what they sound like. This is the start of Bach's Invention in C major BWV 772. So you can hear the counterpoint there and the independent nature of the voices. The opposite type of this music is homophonic music, which is typically made up of an accompaniment and a melody like you'd find in most forms of popular music. Elton John, for instance, accompanies himself on the piano while he sings, so his music would be considered homophonic. Just to give you an example of the difference between these two types of musical textures, if I were to play a C major scale in thirds, it would be considered contrapuntal, where you can hear the two independent melodic lines at the same time. If I were to play it with chords in the left hand though, this would be considered homophonic. However, that's not to say that you can't find contrapuntal music in homophonic music and vice versa. In fact, the two are hardly ever mutually exclusive. Counterpoint is an important aspect to Elton John's music, and homophony is also an important aspect to Bach's music. What links them both together is voice leading, which is the way that voices or melodies in a piece interact with each other. Let me just explain this a little bit more, since this is an important point to understand if you're trying to improvise in the style of Bach. If you take a G7 chord, for example, it's important to consider which specific notes to use when moving on to a subsequent chord. In other words, you want to make sure that you have good voice leading. Since G7 naturally wants to resolve to a chord of C, let's use G7 to C as an example progression. So if you think of each note in the G7 chord as a voice, the question you have to ask yourself is, where does each voice naturally want to resolve to in the chord of C, which contains the notes C, E, and G? Well, the outer notes of the G7 chord, so B and D in the arrangement that I have it here, are the most important, since they are the most audible. So let's think about those first. The rule here is that you want to find a note in the subsequent chord that is close by to the note in the original chord, okay? So, the closest note that's in the chord of C to the top note of the G7 chord in this position is C. So that'll be the top note of our C chord, okay? D, the bottom note of the G7 chord, is equidistant from both C and E, so it doesn't really matter which note we move to, but since we're going to move the top note up, it might be nice to move the bottom note down. So let's move it to C. The same thing applies to F, so let's move that to E. And G can just stay where it is, okay? So just to reiterate that, in the G7 chord, we're going to move B to C, D to C, F to E, and G is going to stay where it is. Okay? So the whole chord change will sound like this. So you can hear all of the different voices there moving between the two chords. This sounds much more natural than moving from G7 to other arrangements of the notes in the C chord. So this would be considered kind of bad voice leading if you were to do this. Right? Because you have loads of different jumps in the voices there. So make sure to consider which specific arrangements of chords you're using if you find yourself reading from a chord chart at any point. So all of that was just a bit of a pretext to our Bach improvisation to get you thinking about some of the ideas I'll be talking about, and also just to let you know how this sort of thinking about voice leading and counterpoint can be applied to all forms of music, including modern music. Now let's move on to how we might make an improvisation out of the chord progression from the opening section of Ombre My Fou in the style of Bach. I won't go into the chords in detail in this video, so if you haven't already seen my first video of this series about improvising in the style of Mozart, you might just want to quickly pause this and go back and have a look at the start of that video where I explain the basic chord progression. You can also download the booklet linked in the video description, which has a chord chart with all of the chords for you to follow along with. So let me just play through the chord progression once so it's in our ears. The piece is in 3/4, meaning that there are 3 quarter note beats, or crotchet beats if you're in the UK, in a bar. So you can try and count along while I play. And again, if you haven't heard the original version of this piece, you might want to go quickly check that out in Bill's intro video to this series. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So that was the chord progression from the first 15 bars of Ombre My Fou. Don't pay attention to the arrangements of the chords that I was using. That's just the basic outline. Now, you might have noticed in the recording at the beginning of this video that the improvisation was mainly happening in my left hand. So that's just so that we can keep it fairly straightforward for now, since things get more complex the more you try to vary the skeleton of the piece and the melody and things like that. So let's just stick to focusing on the left hand for now. The other thing that you might have noticed is that I was changing the rhythms in the left hand. It wasn't just one type of beat throughout, so it's not just a steady pattern all the way through. This is an important part about improvising contrapuntal music, since you don't want to feel like you have to keep playing notes all the time in either voice. The trick is to keep the rhythm flowing in one hand, but generally not both at the same time. So if your right hand is playing quarter notes or crotchets, your left hand can just be holding a sustained note, like I did in the beginning of my improvisation earlier in the video, which went like this. You'll notice there that in bar 2, my left hand was just holding a sustained note while the right hand moved down in the melody. So how do we start creating a melodic line for the left hand that will work with the right hand melody? Well, this is where you have to really know the notes in each chord of the progression. In bar 1, for example, the chord of F has F, A, and C. We should obviously start with an F, since it's the first bar and you want to establish the key, But after that, we have a choice of which notes to use. So you can either do a simple pattern like F, A, C on each of the beats. So it'd go something like that. Or you can move up from F to A through G, which is what I did in my original improvisation. So it went like this. And this is fine to do because the G acts as what is called a passing note between the F and the A. So even though the G is not in the chord of F, it's fine to do that. In fact, as long as you have a note that belongs to the chord at each change of each chord in the progression, you can use as many of these passing notes as you like. You can also use what are called neighbor notes, which is moving from the note to the note above it and back down, or moving from the note to the note below it and back up. So that's just another alternative. Anyway, for now, let's just use the notes I like to use for bar 1, which is just moving from F to A through G. So in bar 2, we have the chord C7, which contains the notes C, E, G, and B flat. If we use F, G, and A in the left hand in bar 1, this would naturally lead us then to the B flat of the C7 chord in bar 2. The reason for this is because of what I was talking about earlier in the video, that is voice leading. So remember here that the rule is that you want to find a note in the subsequent chord that is close by to the note in the preceding chord. B flat is the closest note from the C7 chord to A, so I'm going to use that here. And I'm just going to hold it for the entire bar since the right hand is moving down. As I mentioned before, you want to keep the rhythm flowing in either hand, but generally not both at the same time if you want to keep things simple. Moving on to bar 3, we're back to a chord of F. So we can just do the opposite of what we did in bar 1, this time moving away from the B flat, back down to F. And we're going to use another passing note of G there, okay? So starting off with the A at the beginning of bar 3 in the left hand gives us a nice harmony with the right hand melody there as well. So that's why I picked that note as opposed to going up to the C, which is another alternative, right? When we get to bar 4, which is where the harmonic pace, that is the pace at which the chords change, quickens, the easiest thing to do is just play the bottom note of each chord. So that's B flat, G, and F. Since the chords here are B flat, C7 over G, and F. So let me just play you an example of what the first 5 bars could sound like in the left hand. Okay, so that's just the left hand covering some of the topics that I was just talking about. Now, in bar 6, where we have this C7 chord with a D in the melody, and you can call it a C9 if you want, or a G minor 6 over B flat, or an E half diminished over B flat. But either way, there are a lot of notes to choose from, since the chord has B flat, C, E, G, and D. Now, generally, throughout this whole improvisation, you want to be prioritizing intervals of thirds and sixths, okay? That's why I chose the A as the first note in the left hand in bar 3. Now, don't worry if you don't understand what an interval is. If that's the case, then you can just go and check out the video description where I'll put a link to one of Bill's videos explaining what they are. For now, just think of them as this type of sound or this type of sound. So the distance between the notes C and E would be a third, and the distance between the notes E and C would be a sixth. Again, if you don't understand this, please just go and check out the video linked in the description. Anyway, getting back to the chord in bar 6, the only interval that is either a sixth or a third that's available to put under the D in the melody from the underlying C7 chord is a third, which is a B flat. So that's the note that you'll want to use. You could use a G instead, which would give you the interval of a fifth, but that gives you a very open sound with no solid harmony. So you probably don't want to use that unless you're planning on moving to the B flat later in the bar, which would also be perfectly fine. As I mentioned, in the style of Bach, you want to prioritize intervals of thirds and sixths over intervals of fourths and fifths and octaves. Obviously, the E and the C in the C7 chord wouldn't really go with the D in the melody. They sound very clashy, and that isn't really suitable for Bach, so you probably don't want to use those. So let's just stick with the B flat in the left hand and move on to the A in the next bar, like this. One thing I should just say at this stage is that for those of you who are a bit more advanced and who might know about Bach's music, you might be thinking, oh, well, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Bach would never use a tritone in the bass like he did in the improvisation at the start. Or you might think, well, he's using loads of unprepared dissonances and ignoring the rules of harmony or something like that. But the thing about improvisation is that you have to keep things simple so as not to drown yourself with information and therefore make yourself unable to improvise because you're so worried about all the different rules. My advice is always just to keep things simple and manageable, and once you've gotten a bit more advanced and this type of thing is easy, then you can start to refine things a bit more. The other thing to note about this is that Bach himself often actually broke the rules of counterpoint himself. There are plenty of examples in his music where he has parallel fifths and unprepared dissonances and tritone leaps and all those sorts of things. But Bach was using his ear to guide him, and that's what we should be doing. So as opposed to just following rules or a set of traditions, we should be doing the same thing. So that means that if you feel like putting in a dissonance that might not be the most stylistic, or if you want to put in some pedal here or there or things like that, then you should just go for it. Try it out and see what it sounds like. So for the rest of the progression, we're just going to keep going and doing the same things that we were doing with the first 6 bars, and we're going to finish out the left hand. Just to quickly recap some of these types of things that we were talking about, one thing is we're going to be primarily thinking about the notes within the chords, making sure that we have a chord note at the change of each chord within the progression. We're also going to be thinking about voice leading. So that's the thing that we talked about earlier in the video. So not making too many big skips of lots of notes in the left hand. So for example, in bar 2, there's a C chord. We're not going to move from F to C like this, because that sounds clunky. We're going to move F to C going to the B flat within the C7 chord, okay, because that's close by. We're also going to avoid having the hands play at the same time, so we either want the right hand sustaining while the left moves, or vice versa. You can hear that in the improvisation I did at the beginning in the first 2 bars. Right hand is sustaining, now left hand is sustaining. Okay? And then finally, we're going to be thinking about the intervals between the right and the left hand. So we're going to be trying to aim for thirds and sixths. Okay? So we're going to be prioritizing sounds like this or this. Now, all that might sound like a heck of a lot of things to remember and to think about, but the key here is just to try and play around with things. Try to come up with a left hand that sounds musical to you. And that's really important. Don't worry about what other people might think about your playing. Just try to find ways of doing this that sound convincing to you. So let me just play you an example of what the complete progression could sound like in the left hand, taking into consideration some of the things that I just mentioned. Okay, so you'll notice that there in bar 12, I used eighth notes or quavers, and that was just to add some rhythmic drive before reaching that C chord in bar 13, where the music starts coming to a close. You might also notice that in the improvisation at the start of this video, I played a G and an F together in the second last bar. And that was just to make it a bit more stylistic, even though, yes, it is an unprepared dissonance. Ideally, you'd prepare it beforehand, but since we're only using 2 voices throughout, I just thought that I would introduce it there at the end. Now, as I said, don't worry if you find all of this difficult. If that's the case, my advice would be to first make sure to go over this video a few times and try to understand all the concepts that we covered. Then go to the piano and try and come up with a left-hand melody, but keep it very slow until you can keep a steady rhythm. You want to make sure that you keep a good rhythm throughout, even if this means playing really slowly with a metronome. And don't be afraid to go really, really slowly with it, okay? Make sure to bring it down to a good speed that allows you to get all the way through while keeping a steady rhythm. Once you've done that, you can speed things up. On the other hand, if you're finding all of this really easy and you want to make things a bit more difficult, try to vary the rhythm in the left hand by adding in a few more notes, like this. Okay, so that's just the first 9 bars there. You can also change some of the harmonies and add in embellishments like mordents, for example. So this is a mordent. And if you're feeling really ambitious, you can even try and add in another voice to turn it into a 3-part invention. Just remember that that's really advanced. You don't want to be trying that without first spending a lot of time with just 2 voices, okay? So let's just have a quick listen to what something a bit more advanced might sound like. This is another improvisation that I did on the same theme. So just try to notice a few of the extra things that I'm adding in. So that was a more advanced version of an improvisation on Ombre My Fou in the style of Bach. Remember that exploring this type of improvisation should be fun to do, so keep things simple and manageable and don't get caught up making yourself feel bad for wrong notes or unstylistic playing. It's important to get into the flow of your improvisations, even if you're just starting out and learning. So don't go too hard on yourself and enjoy the process. Remember to set aside a regular time as well to practice your improvisation every day. This is really important, and if you do this, I promise you'll get better. Okay, this video is going on really long now, so I'm going to have to stop, but please remember that if you like this tutorial, give it a thumbs up and make sure to share it with some of your friends. Feel free to leave any comments or questions you might have down in the comment section. And if you haven't done so already, don't forget to subscribe to both Bill's channel and my channel for the rest of the videos in this series. Other than that, keep improvising, enjoy yourself, and we'll see you in the next video.